The Great Speck. Have you ever looked around the room on a sunny day and seen little specks of dust floating in the air? They look like stars when the light catches them, and the very small people who live on them think that's what other specks of dust are. The one particular speck I'm thinking of was about 1/100th the size of the period at the end of this sentence, and was called Great Speck. There were two countries on it, Grabbist on the left-hand side and Posra on the right. In the middle was a range of very small mountains. On the highest mountain lived an astronomer called Gwymper, who, as Great Speck floated around, watched all the other specks with great interest. Of course, no one believed that life existed on the other dust motes. Then one day Gwymper thought he saw something on a speck not far away. "What's that?" asked the king of Posra, while Gwymper stood before him waving his arms and pointing. "Trees!" gasped the astronomer. "Mountains! Animals!" Said the king. "About how far away is it?" Gwymper went through his pockets until he found a piece of paper covered with equations. "It's headed towards Great Speck at great speed, and it will pass within an inch of us in 30 seconds, he said. A second was about as long as a day for the Speck people. At the same moment, Wince Parsley, another astronomer, was saying exactly the same thing to the Duke of Grabbist. Now, Great Speck had been at peace for, at least half an hour, but that's not to say that either country would not be above pulling a fast one on the other if they got the chance. So both countries immediately set about finding ways of getting to New Speck without letting the other know. "But how?" asked Gwymper. Since they were so small, the people naturally floated, but the problem was how to propel themselves across the inch. He finally built a sort of covered rowboat with 2 pairs of wings and a lot of ornamental carving. "What a splendid looking craft," said the king when it was brought to him. "I can see you will enjoy the trip." There was a thoughtful silence. "Me?" asked Gwymper. "But yes," said the king. "I thought we ought to kind of send some animals or something to find out if it's safe," began Gwymper nervously. "I'm sure you'll find out," said the king heartily, slapping him on the back. Gwymper returned miserably to his observatory and peered up at New Speck. It was already bigger. What would happen if he missed and got lost? He shuddered when he looked into the infinite immensity of the air and saw millions of dust motes up there. Meanwhile, the king's servants dragged the flying machine up to a small hill overlooking the palace and filled it full of provisions. Then they put a fence around it and charged admission for people who wanted to come and look. The second of the great leap grew nearer. "Where's Gwymper?" cried the king of Posra as the second arrived. "I've got to give him a medal before he takes off. Don't expect there'll be a chance afterward." The crowds were all gathered around the astronomer's flying machine, which was called the Anybody, but Gwymper was nowhere to be seen. But he could be heard, for the toilets nearby had been occupied for a very long time, and a lot of flushing noises were coming out of there. Then, at last, he appeared, looking very sheepish in an oversized flying helmet and goggles. The band immediately struck up the Posrian national anthem. "3 cheers for us!" and the king threw a huge tin medal around his neck, like a hula hoop. It hung there sadly on a red ribbon. "Well, goodbye, old friend," said the king. "Remember to plant the Prosian flag on that New Speck. We've put a record of the national anthem in the Anybody. I understand that Grabbist is sending a flying machine too. I don't need to tell you that you'll land first. Hint, hint, do I?" Gwymper climbed into the Anybody and started the engine. A runway had been built down the side of one hill, and halfway up another one. The idea was that the Anybody would gather speed and whiz up the hill and away from Great Speck. Or it might crash. Suddenly, the crowd rushed up and gave it a jolly good push. They didn't care. Anything for a laugh was their motto. Gwymper hung on tightly when the anybody shot up the hill. He felt his stomach turn over, and then the flying machine was flapping quietly through the air. I don't quite believe it, he thought, looking out of the rear window. Great Speck was floating quite a ways behind, and somebody was behind him, bang on the hatch. It turned out to be the king. "They didn't wait to push till I got off," he shrieked as Gwymper let him scramble in. "Take me back!" "I'm not sure if I can," said Gwymper, who was secretly pleased. "Great Speck is rushing away from us. If you remember, I did tell you that I probably wouldn't be able to get back." "Did you? What did we say?" "You told me not to worry, Your Majesty." The king looked out of the window. There was nothing but nothing all around them. A few distant dust specks glittered, and far, far below was the hill they'd taken off from. "Can't we signal them?" said the king. "Actually, I did work out a way to signal back to Great Speck," said Gwymper. He opened a cupboard and produced 2 flags, then opened the window and started semaphoring to the fast disappearing speck of dust. "My assistant is tracking us through the telescope," he said, waving his arms. "I've just signalled the king, may he live forever, etc., 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 is alive and well and up here with me. Now just pass me that little telescope, sire. That's right. Let's see now. Ah, yes. The reply is, 'Get him down again, you crazy booby.' But I'm afraid I can't." "How far have we gone?" asked the king. Gwymper twiddled some dials. "About 1/15 of an inch," he said. "Not bad progress." The king took off his crown. "I was a bit of an adventurer in my youth," he said wistfully. "Can I be the first one to set foot on the new Speck?" "Certainly," said Gwymper generously. "Right then, tell me how the controls work." Soon the king was flying the anybody and enjoying himself tremendously. When the new Speck appeared, Gwymper put the anybody into orbit. "I think we'll call it New Speck," said the king as they gazed down at it. "Look, there are some mountains and things. Wonder if anything lives down there." The anybody floated slowly downward and landed with a slight bump. "Me first!" shouted the king, jumping out with the Parisian flag in his hand. Gwymper followed slowly, carrying a record player, and the 2 of them stood at attention while it played a rather scratchy record of the Parisian national anthem, "3 Cheers for Us." "Right," said the king. "You take a photo of me and I'll take one of you." But Gwymper was busily breaking up bits of dust with a hammer and looking at them through a microscope, so the king wandered off by himself. New Speck was quite rough, with boulders and large stones everywhere. Soon the king sat down on one and watched the astronomer collecting plants in a canvas bag. The rock stood up, shook off the king, and ran away on 4 stumpy little legs. "Remarkable," said Gwymper. "Ouch!" cried the king. "Look, there's another of them." The rock had opened 2 little beady eyes and sat looking at them. Then they heard, a long ways off, a record being played rather badly. Gwymper and the king stared at each other, and as the music went on, they began to realise what it was. "Perish her enemies by fire, the sword drowning, etc. Grabbist the brave, pom-ti-pom." "It's the clugging Grabistian national anthem," raged the king. "The woodling mouse-shirters have gone and gotten here." "Shh!" hissed Gwymper, peering over the rocks. There he saw in a little valley a flying machine, very like the anybody, with the name Everybody written on it. He recognised the Grabistian astronomer, Parsley, and standing next to him, winding up the record player again, was the Duke of Grabist. "The great ninny grumblers," cursed the king, "landing on our speck of dust. Let's put 'em to the sword. Perish their enemies indeed." He was shouting so loudly that soon the Duke and astronomer came bounding over the hill. "You!" said everybody at once. "Get off our new Speck," bellowed the Duke and the king together. "This means war," they added. "Beastly trespasser! Claim jumper!" Parsley and Gwymper wandered off, leaving the other 2 shouting and jumping up and down. "I'm worried about how we're going to get back," confided Parsley. "Me too." This doesn't look like a very pleasant place, Wins Parsley said, waving his hand at the rocks and the little stone creatures. Very bleak, yes. I can't help thinking their majesties are getting worked up about nothing. What are we going to do about it? At that moment there was a rumbling noise, and a herd of the stone creatures came charging up the valley, trampling over the Grabastian machine. Oh no! Everybody's destroyed! Wins Parsley whimpered. The creatures surged over the hill. There was another crash. There goes the anybody too, moaned Gwymper. Now we're both stuck. They rushed over the hill to find the king and the duke building a wall and shouting at each other over the top of it. Our ships have been destroyed, yelled Gwymper. Come over onto our side of the wall and stop consorting with the enemy, said the king. We can't get back home, screamed Wins Parsley at the top of his voice. There was a sudden silence. The king and the duke looked up at the distant specks of dust. The great speck is just over an inch away and getting farther with every microsecond, said Gwymper. Even if they built another ship, they could never rescue us and get back. We're stuck. Those stone things have trodden on the ships, and there are no spare parts. Right, now what are we going to do? Are you sure the ships are wrecked? Asked the duke. They're ruined, said Wins Parsley. Then we're stuck. I don't like this place, said the king. Gwymper looked at the remains of anybody and the everybody and had an idea. I wonder if we could take them both apart and make another one with the pieces, he said. So while the king and the duke sat by a small fire, the two astronomers started taking the flying machines apart. They used the hull, gas stove, steering wheel and seats from the anybody, and the wings, motor and instruments from the everybody. While they were working, the king caught one of the stone creatures, but there didn't seem to be any way of eating it. All that was left of the provisions in the ships was half a loaf of bread, some rather smelly cheese, and, no one knew why, a jar of glazed cherries. It's a rule of the known universe that every kitchen in the world, everywhere, has a jar of glazed cherries hiding somewhere in it. No one knows why. Stop fighting over them, said Gwymper. We think we've got a working ship. They all climbed onto the ship, which Wins Parsley had named Somebody, and Gwymper pulled a few levers. The wings flapped and the ship rose. Well, goodbye, new Speck, said the king. I'm glad to leave, even though it belongs to me. To me, you mean? Said the duke, waving his arms. The ship hovered over the speck of dust while the astronomers looked around for Great Speck. That's it, said Gwymper. The green one, floating over there by the table. The somebody speeded up, and it wasn't long before it landed in the mountains that separated the countries of Posra from Grabist. The king and the duke rushed out and away down the mountains in opposite directions. Here we go again, said Wins Parsley as he helped unload the ship. They'll be arguing again tomorrow. Argue, argue, argue. You'd think they might have learnt their lesson by now. They might have learned to cooperate. They might still, said Gwymper thoughtfully. I've just noticed something. They were so eager to get home, they each ran down the wrong side of the mountains. The duke has gone into Posra, and the king has run down into Grabist. Gosh, what'll happen to them? Oh, they might get put in prison for a little while, but I dare say the people will swap them. Though one duke's as good as another, if you ask me. And the astronomers went and had a cup of tea in Gwymper's observatory and played chess together until midnight. The end.